Well, good morning, Facebook family. I'm Shannon Sims, and today we've got an interesting conversation. We're going to talk about the R word. It's an ugly word for a lot of people, and it makes them feel uncomfortable. But we're in a space and place in time where we feel it's important to talk about that word. And you're wondering, what is she talking about? Well, we're talking about racism, reconciliation, and restoration. And today we have a group of faith leaders from across southeastern Wisconsin here to have that discussion with us. And I first want to introduce Jay English from Parklawn. If you could go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll have all of our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll get started on this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon, so much. So again, my name is Jay English. I serve as a next generation pastor for Parklawn Assembly of God in Milwaukee.
Good morning, beloved. My name is Kurt Boyd. I serve as senior pastor of Way of the Cross Baptist Church here in Milwaukee.
Hi, my name is Kurt Owens. I serve as president of Milwaukee Declaration and also as pastor of You Flourish Church.
My name is Peter Borg, and I was formerly a pastor of City Brook Church.
My name is Matt Erickson. I'm the senior pastor of Eastbrook Church on Green Bay Avenue here in Milwaukee and a co-founder of the Milwaukee Declaration.
Hi, my name is Kevin Penvos, and I'm pastor with Unity Lutheran Church here in Milwaukee.
Hello, I'm Arnita Holloman. I'm with the Office of Violence Prevention and a member of World Outreach Center.
So let's start from the beginning. A lot of times when we talk about race, it's how it was introduced to us growing up. So I want to start by asking Kurt Owens, how was race introduced to you growing up as a child and later on into your adult life?
Interesting question. I think for me, it started from within the household. My dad was born in 1936. During the Jim Crow era. And so some of the things that he went through, he instilled in his children, and some of those things that he instilled in his family as children that essentially we were less than, in America as when it came to the black and white dynamic. But also when I went to school and I was sat in front of TV and watched the civil rights movement, I seen, dogs biting people who look like me. I seen water hose being sprayed on people who look like me. And so at a very early age, and I can even remember going back to kindergarten, like it was reinforced that I was less than, anyone else within our community. And so that was my introduction to race.
Matt, I'm wondering how, being a pastor of a multicultural church, how was your introduction to race?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I remember being a really young kid going to be dropped off at preschool by my dad, who was an educator, and he carpooled with another man, Alex, who was African American, and I would sit in the middle seat right between these two educators. And I think, at that point, it was like my first sense of, people exist who look different than me as kind of a 3-year-old kid. And but I saw both of them go on to get their PhDs in education and achieve a lot. Later on, in where I grew up in the Mississippi River Valley of Illinois, I experienced different things, running track and cross country. I remember my friend Dwayne, who we ran past his house and where he lived, and we began talking about that as middle school kids at a deeper level. It was really more later on that I began to grasp what it meant to grow up in a racialized society, and some of the things that I began to think about as a pastor came a lot later. I grew up in a predominantly Caucasian setting. And so it really wasn't until later that I really had kind of eyes open to a new way of thinking about the world and about society.
Jay, can you expound on being a pastor in an inner city church? How has race played a role in your development?
Absolutely. It's been eye-opening. I obviously grew up in an African-American environment, but I also went to private school where I was typically one of the few African-Americans. Moving to Milwaukee has been eye-opening across the board, looking at the disparities specifically in education, economics. You're talking about the widest education gap in the nation, seeing the incarceration rate the way it is. So serving here as a pastor and being involved with so many people who are hurting and seeing how there's this cycle of poverty that keeps replaying itself has been unbelievable. From an eye-opening perspective, just seeing how people who want to be better, want to get better, have to work so much harder just to get back to an even playing ground. So that's been, again, very eye-opening and an experience looking at Milwaukee saying, wow, we've got to really do some work to help things change. Because some of this that's going on are not choices. They're things that are literally very much happening to people.
Now, I'm going to paraphrase this. Dr. King said, you know, the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday is probably the most segregated hour in Christian America. And that was said in 1960. Fast forward to today, 2020. My question is for you, faith leaders, what do you believe is the failure of the church that has perpetuated systematic racism? Anyone can chime in.
I'll speak. As a historian, we see back even to the late 1700s that predominantly white denominations chose numerical growth over biblical racial justice. And so it's been a failure to speak out and a desire to be seen as successful in saving souls that ended up crushing human beings to accomplish that.
Come on now.
If I may.
I'll have something to say.
Yeah. I just to add to what Peter was saying, I would say on two different levels, kind of on a personal level, we in the church, we want to be nice. And this conversation today was introduced that it can be uncomfortable. And so to bring up uncomfortable topics feels like we're not being nice. And so we avoid those conversations in the church. So there's that personal level. But then on a broader level, the church, like any social institution, participates within the broader society. And so, especially in my denomination, I can say from experience that the church, as it participates in economics, we've seen what we call white flight out of cities. And so that numerical growth or just trying to survive as an organization, we often see racism played out systemically through those avenues.
And I'm just gonna add in. I was trying to give somebody else a chance to talk, but still would like to just speak to that. I think the church unfortunately has colored the gospel according to their culture. And unfortunately, the gospel looks more closer to our culture than it does to what Christ intended for it to be. And so even when we look at the first church, we're talking about a church that was completely diverse of people from all nations and all tongues. Somewhere along the line, again, we just missed it. When we began to start looking at the gospel through the lens of our culture, we miss it, as opposed to looking at the gospel through the lens of humanity, of whom God has created. And so I always say in all of these, you know, I have no standards for the world, but I do hold the church to higher standards. And so it should not be a place where we are segregated. It should be a place actually where we have an opportunity to integrate our relationships, even if we have to drive in to those churches and places and spaces to be able to make that happen.
So do you believe that the influence that all of you have as faith leaders, leading a flock, leading a congregation, that you have to now interject or be, I should say, maybe intentional about how you are feeding people in regards to what is happening around them and also how they can be a part of the change?
I think you absolutely have to. This is not going to change by just waiting on it to, you know, hey, if we just leave it alone in a little while, it'll work itself out. We literally have to look at how we're presenting the message of the gospel. We have to look at historical perspectives of how things have been taught, going all the way back to the origin of the Bible, even, and the realities of so much of that taking place in Africa that we don't deal with. For us as African Americans, if I'm being really honest, something we don't talk a lot about is our own lack of integration. But a lot of that is because the church is the one place that I get where I can just be me. And if I have any problems with anybody, I know it's at least not because of this. That's a reality, you know, that we have to walk in and understand. This is the one place where I can get celebrated. It's the one place where people look like me and I can just be who I am. And a lot of times we feel like we have to wear a mask the rest of the week. So it's hard when you say, well, I need you to come out of that. And we're saying, man, but I'm out of that all week long. This is the only place I get where I don't have to do that. So I think that's part of it too.
That's a good point. I wonder, when you have congregations that are predominantly white, and how do you then, I hate to use the word integrate, because heaven is not going to be integrated. Heaven is going to be what it is, and that is what God has created. And that's all of us. So how do you welcome all of us into institutions that for so long have denied us access, even in the church, without it looking like a prop?
That's a tough question, isn't it, Shannon? I mean, if we could have a really simple answer to that, a lot of things would probably be different. But I mean, Eastbrook, where I'm at, is a multi-ethnic church. And we believe that's part of the solution, even though what Jay's just saying totally makes sense. And I've had conversations with dear friends who kind of live in that tension as well. I mean, I think that how do you create a culture within a church that expects difference, that values difference, that honors difference, that listens to each other? I mean, I think one of the things that the church, when you talked about before about being intentional, the church has to be a place where we can talk about these things. I mean, in our culture at large, it's very hard for people to talk. I mean, we have a divided political moment. We have a divided country and so many things. The church should be the place where we can come together and talk about these things. But it does take, I would say, I'm speaking to myself as a white pastor, a letting go of power, empowering people, giving voice to others, having conversations like this and helping people to listen to each other and then make that into a culture change. It's one thing to be multi-ethnic. It's another thing to be a church that's multicultural, that's developing a culture of the kingdom that's not still just run by kind of a dominant cultural way, if I can say it that way. So it does take some of that letting go of power, I think, and changing and being willing to change together as a church community to look more like that vision of heaven, Revelation 7, 9, and 10, every tribe, tongue, nation, and people together. But I think it's hard. It's hard work.
Anita.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, did you want to chime in on this one?
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think there necessarily has to be anything done to intentionally change the way the church looks. I think that people worship where they feel comfortable, where they feel welcome, and where they feel like they belong. And the history of the church, like you quoted Dr. King saying that, Sunday is the most segregated day of the week, is because we were shut out of so many places. We had to create spaces for ourselves. And so I also echo Pastor Jay in saying that, that is a safe space where I don't want to have to be concerned about how I'm going to be treated, how I'm going to be viewed, any of those things. And so I think the church will look different when the racial landscape of this nation and our communities look and feel different, and not just in a superficial way, but when they are different in terms of equity and justice, then we will see changes in all of these institutions, including the church.
So, and that makes sense to me. And I understand being comfortable, being around your own. But sometimes if we do that too long, we don't experience other people and what they bring to the table and how we can value their beauty, their difference. So even if you're saying, yes, I want to worship and feel comfortable with my own, how then though do you make sure that the church is still modeling what the world should look like and be like and how we should interact? What are you doing at your churches to try to bridge the gap between the race issue of not understanding one another or having our implicit biases?
Let me just chime in on that topic. I think this is one of the reasons why the Milwaukee Declaration Group is so important. As you can see, most of the pastors, matter of fact, all of the pastors on this panel, other than Anita, is a member of the Milwaukee Declaration Group, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-denominational initiative. But it's about being intentional in our of neighboring. If Christians could just simply be good neighbors, the foundational teachings of Jesus Christ, just be, and I'm talking about a neighbor, to your next door neighbor. And we've been doing some series of teachings. All of us, all of the pastors on this panel have been doing series of teachings on the art of neighboring. How do you engage with your neighbors that live right next door to you? Most of us, we go in and out of our homes. We see our neighbors, and sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. If we have an attached garage, Lord knows, we don't see them at all. And so, but to be intentional, to be a good neighbor, get to know your neighbor, and just have the hard conversation. At some point, you build a relationship and you can have those hard conversations. But I think that's the key. Be a good neighbor. And you'll find a lot of times those neighbors are not church, they're not Christian. And then you can start inviting these neighbors into your church, into your community, get them to share Jesus Christ or get them to accept Christ. And the church, the face of the church will change. But it has to start with love, and it's got to start with neighboring.
Can I just want to chime on that really quickly. I agree with OG Kurt. Certainly, I think with the Milwaukee Declaration, what we've done is we've taken, some of us have homogenous churches, whether they're all black, whether they're all white, but as we have had the opportunity to become neighbors with one another. But the other part of that, I think, with the churches, because you have some churches that if you're in a community that's 98% white, or you're in a community that's homogenous, in the other direction, I think the other ways that we can do that, I think, is that we can be intentional about how we plant churches. I always say that, two homogenous churches could come together and plant a multi-ethnic church. So I think as long as we create the platforms and the opportunities, whether you want to belong to a homogenous church, there's an opportunity for you to do that. Whether you want to belong to a diverse church, that we have some options. And unfortunately, we don't have as many options as I would like to see in our city of Milwaukee. Certainly, we do have some multi-ethnic churches. There's not very many that's multi-ethnic churches that's minority led. I would like to see a change in that in our city. But certainly, I think there's something that everyone could do to be a part of that. And as we begin to establish more churches in our city.
All right, let's get to it. Outside of your church doors, there's a lot going on. And a lot of what's going on are with members that are inside of your church. So right now, we all know that everyone, or a lot of people, are looking at the topic, Black Lives Matter. And it says and means different things, apparently, to different people. So I want to hear from you what that phrase means, and does it go beyond the phrase, Black Lives Matter? Kurt Boyd?
I think the most important thing is to understand Black Lives Matter. It is not saying that other lives don't, but I think the key is it means Black Lives Matter too. Unborn children lives matter to God. All lives matter to God. And so what we're saying is Black lives matter too.
A helpful perspective I've heard is when white people say, well, I'm unemployed, my life is really difficult, my kids aren't going to private school, we're shopping at Goodwill, whatever it is that Black Lives Matter isn't saying that other people's lives in America aren't difficult. It's simply saying that it's not as a result of the color of their skin that white people have whatever challenges they have in their lives. And I think that's an important thing that people who are bothered by the Black Lives Matter statement and movement need to reckon with. This is not saying Black lives are more difficult than anybody else's, although I think we could argue that in generally they probably are, but it's saying that it's the color of their skin that is adding something that doesn't happen for white Americans.
I think, unfortunately, our history has said Black lives have not mattered. And if we're being really honest about American history, we can go all the way back to us coming here and being treated as subhuman, being treated as less than animals. Animals actually were treated better than we were. You fast forward through the 3/5 Amendment, which I don't know how many people even realize that's still part of the Constitution, even to this day, that our entire electorate system is still based on us being slaves. So when we have the conversation around, delegates and how our presidents are being selected and all those different things, and people are like, well, you just need to vote. Well, actually, you know what? I've got a problem with the voting process because it still considers me 3/5 of a person, and it's based on certain states getting certain numbers of delegates based on the number of slaves they had back during that time. So there's so much that goes on, from the lynchings, we can go through the redlining, we can go through the sharecropping, which was still slavery, the Jim Crow laws. There's a number of things that lead me to believe that my life does not matter as much as maybe Peter Borgs or Pastor Matt or Pastor Kevin here. And when I'm saying Black Lives Matter, I'm trying to tell you that for so long, mine has not. I don't want to be treated as less than. I don't want to have you look at me because of this and ignore who I am as a person. I matter. So I think the best explanation I had was actually a Caucasian pastor who said he did a funeral for an infant that passed. And he said of how foolish it would have been to have this funeral and be standing at the casket talking about this infant dying and someone in the back yelling out, all babies' lives matter. Be present, be in the moment. If I hurt, from a Christian perspective, mourn with those that mourn. If any of us are hurting, we should all be hurting. And right now, Black people are hurting, and we're trying best we can to tell the world our lives need to matter just as much as everyone else's.
And I do believe that even the media has perpetuated this call for action, in the sense that we have seen a number of Black men who have been unarmed die in the hands of police custody. However, we've shown this video with no problems of seeing someone lose their life in a video. We've shown it and not stopped to say, wait a minute, that's a person. We have to have these conversations even in our newsroom about what is appropriate to share. And I think that when people saw George Floyd, for example, no one could deny the anguish that was seen in his eyes, as well as how everyone was responding around. And I'm wondering and asking you guys, was it a wake-up call that we realized what was at our door had always been there and we need to address it now?
I think, Shannon, it's both a wake-up call and it's a reminder. It's a reminder call, because I think we've been saying this as Black folks. We've been saying it. Other folks have been saying it. The cry has been going out for children that are still locked up in cages at borders. These calls have been going out for a very long time, for hundreds of years at this point, right? That Black lives matter, that African lives matter, that the descendants of enslaved people matter. And it's not that this is something new. Obviously, we know that, but there are so many ways in which we have been shown that our lives are insignificant to other people. Not so much that we don't think our lives matter. We know that it does, but the way we are treated, the unfair, criminal justice system, all of these practices, policies, laws have worked not in our favor, but have systematically worked against us. And then when you think about media, the media has not only kind of lifted up some of these, the killings that have happened, people being murdered in the street, but it also has perpetuated the negative stereotypes about Black people over and over and over again. You think about the city of Milwaukee, and there are people that literally don't want to come into the city because they think they're going to be shot. I've lived in Milwaukee all my life, never been shot at, any of those things. That is not the whole of what our city looks like. And so the message then is what is a part of the problem, and that has been perpetuated both by the media and other systems and structures that has repeatedly made Black life look insignificant, devalued, and not worthy of being named. And so we're naming it. Our lives matter. Black lives matter.
To that point about naming it. When it comes to the conversation within the church about Black Lives Matter, we start from the position that we're all God's children, and to God all lives matter. And so there can be pushback and confusion for folks to think, well, from that, theological, biblical perspective, why are we just talking about Black Lives Matter? So we need to look at our scriptures and see that precisely because all lives matter to God, God listens to those who are crying out. God pays attention to those who are being marginalized or put down in any way. The entire book of the Bible is that story. I'm getting ready to preach just this Sunday on a story from Acts chapter 6, in which the early church came together, a multitude of peoples and nations, and the Gentile Christians versus the Judaic Hebrew Christians were experiencing different levels of compassion and care within the church. And so the Gentile leaders cried out, hey, our widows are being ignored. And the church leaders, the apostles, said, okay, we need to pay special attention. Your lives matter. And so for the church to frame this conversation biblically, theologically, that God pays attention specifically to those lives that are crying out for justice, because that's God's plan for the world, is to bring justice. There's no other way to do that than pay attention to those who are crying out for it.
And if I can add to that, it's when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and I've had this conversation and discussions with others. Do all lives matter? Absolutely. But just echoing some of what even Jay says, it's just that Black lives have not mattered for far too long. And should we had to say it, Black Lives Matter too? We can get into the semantics of it all, but that's not really necessary. And so, as you mentioned, Shannon, the whole deal with George Floyd, it's amazing that it was at that point that everybody across racial lines finally saw that there was a problem. But in the Black community, essentially, I mean, we felt this pain for quite some time. I mean, we've seen it over and over and over again. And unfortunately, we were in a corner just seeing it together, and nobody else, it appeared, even cared. And I think the thing, again, that really bothered me was not that the world didn't care. What bothered me is that the church didn't care. I have no, I have zero expectations for the world, but the church, if I tell the church that, we don't matter, like, you would think that the church would have loved on us and embraced us and helped address that situation. It's starting to happen now, and I'm thankful for that. But you asked a question, and that's kind of what we've been dealing with for years and years and years as a people.
So it sounds like, we have these great congregations. We've got good people in all of these great congregations, but a lot have been silent. And so now that you're hearing these cries coming from outside of your congregation, and a lot of those people, again, are marching, are doing what they can in their sphere of influence. My question is, as faith leaders, what are you doing in your sphere of influence intentionally to have some reconciliation here in Milwaukee? Because George Floyd is in Minnesota, but we can count off a number of cases here in the city of Milwaukee where we have questioned the injustice of those who have died in the hands of police. So I wonder how you pastors are being intentional, and especially not to put you on the spot, but our white pastors who are on this panel, because this conversation has been happening in the homogenous Black church, but now it needs to have a conversation in other churches and forums that don't look like us, but that are willing to align with Black, brown people. So what intentionally are you doing? I always like to talk about solutions to deal with this reconciliation, to deal with this issue and move forward.
Well, Shannon, my wife and I are 22-year residents of Sherman Park, And we kind of come at this whole conversation a little bit differently because we're a mixed race marriage. So anywhere we would choose to live, we would be integrating that neighborhood. But we chose to live in Sherman Park because there are other marriages like us just even on our block. And so we have, for the 22 years we've lived here, used our house as a place of ministry. And so I think the church needs to get beyond seeing that ministry takes place under the auspices of an institutional church and can be done much more like the early New Testament church, out of homes and with individuals without there being a particular program. It's just people being together. And so, as you know, and you've shot a story on it, we host family dinner every Thursday night where we just open the doors and make a bunch of food, and whoever wants to come and eat, eats. And it's been an instrumental part of God's call on the lives of some white believers who have relocated from the suburbs to live in Sherman Park because Jesus was incarnational with humanity, and white Christians can be incarnational in the way they choose to live based on where they choose to live.
Yeah, so for me, my family also made a very intentional decision about where we choose to live for precisely that reason, the incarnational message of the gospel. As a white pastor, the first step for me is my own personal work in understanding systemic racism, examining my own implicit biases that I have, and then as a faith leader, modeling that process of my own internal work for others, and then not to lead or to be the main speaker, but to step aside, as Pastor Matt said earlier. And what I can do is both model and then amplify the voices of others who are speaking for themselves.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in on that as the third of the white pastors who you specifically addressed, Shannon, there, and just say, part of what the Milwaukee Declaration has been is kind of what Kevin said, has flowed out of my own journey on this and trying to invite others into that journey as well. And really coming out of conversations that Bishop Walter Harvey and I had, and how do we get pastors together across racial lines? And then how do we get this conversation happening in churches all around the city of Milwaukee and beyond? How do we do things that really help people engage in that conversation and then provide platforms for churches to discuss about it? We have a partnership with another ministry in the city, Basics of Milwaukee, that does an event called Front Row Seat, where people are coming together very intentionally to talk about these sorts of things. And so it becomes kind of a big living room, different than what Peter's suggesting, with the family dinner, but that same kind of atmosphere of how do we get people to talk around tables about these kind of things. At Eastbrook, we have a school, K4 through 12th grade school, is very intentionally tried to be a church school that has city and suburbs coming together, people coming from a lot of different backgrounds. And so, that's part of how I get engaged with that as well, through education. And then within that atmosphere, really trying to pour into students' lives, the next generation, so that they have a picture of their experience, that the kind of that beloved community that happens here in Milwaukee, and then can, as they move out from there, can shape their experiences many other places. It's imperfect. We're still on the way, but those are some of the things that we're trying to do at Eastbrook and what I'm trying to be a part of in my own life as well.
Does social justice play a role in your lives and how you steward your church?
I'm assuming, let me just say that I think for me, myself personally, really gospel driven. And so, we kind of use the term biblical justice or use the term kingdom justice because the world has taken the term social justice and made it a negative thing. Now social justice is hijacking the gospel where justice is the gospel. And so when we talk about that, it does not, you cannot divorce justice from the gospel. And so when we speak this message from our churches and to our congregations and the messages that we preach, we don't wait for something bad to happen to start talking about biblical or kingdom justice. This is the message that we preach all around the way, and we don't color the gospel with the flag. Nothing against the flag, but I represent the kingdom of Jesus, and so do not color the gospel with things of this world. And so when we talk about justice, again, it should be something that's preached on a weekly basis through our messages and through our congregations. And I'll let somebody else chime in.
I was wondering, does it seem that even from your followers that justice is apparent? You can see injustices when it's extremely egregious in another country, but for so long, those who have been in your places of worship have not realized the egregious injustices that their brothers and sisters of American ancestry have experienced, who happen to be blessed with Black skin.
Yeah, I think sometimes, Shannon, there's a disconnect between sort of the international side of things. You can talk about the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, where 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. You can talk about the work that happened against the Yazidi people, and talk about religious freedom and different things like that, and a push towards educational reforms in other places. But when we look at our own country, I think maybe even what Kurt Owen said earlier, like we see through certain sets of lenses, our own context and our own way of reading the Bible. Sometimes we just have those gaps in there. So we just did a series at Eastbrook at the beginning of the year on the minor prophets, and you can't read the minor prophets and not get caught up in talk about justice. Amos 5:24, let justice roll down and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. I mean, that's like one of the most famous biblical texts on justice, and it's right in the midst of the minor prophets calling for that in the public square. And so I'm trying to help our congregation have like a holistic understanding of what Kurt talks about biblical justice, and then see how that applies to real issues in our own time and place. And to be honest, like, it's led me into places I didn't think I was getting into. Even these last few weeks, I've been part of different networks, Milwaukee Declaration, other places. Jay can probably speak to this. Arnita could probably speak to this, of being in conversations with some of our elected officials, trying to advocate for public justice issues on this because of our faith. And how do we get engaged with that as Christians? I think we have to have that as part of our discipleship with kingdom gospel understanding. It really shapes not just our private lives, but our public lives. And I just say that in the United States, I think there's a real tension, at least maybe in the evangelical church, on how does our faith translate into the public sphere. And we're not always very well equipped to know how to do that. And that's something that we're trying to navigate through in our own church. And I think that's part of what the Milwaukee Declaration is trying to engage in as well.
I'd say to what Matt is saying, I think that's key. Like, how does our faith translate into what we're doing in the community in terms of social justice? I wouldn't say that social justice has been, colored or has been tainted in some way by folks outside of the church. I think social justice is what it is. It's social justice. And yes, there is a biblical basis and foundation for social justice. So when we think about equitable resources, equitable distributions of wealth, of healthcare, of housing, any of those things, that is both our civic duty to make sure that happens, as well as our duty as believers. I'm not a pastor. I don't necessarily consider myself a faith leader. However, I am in control of how I walk out my faith. And a part of walking out my faith is declaring that justice is needed, it is demanded, and then doing whatever my part is at whatever level to make sure that happens, or to continue that movement forward to make sure that happens for Black lives, for every life.
And I think if the church doesn't integrate justice into its presentation and understanding and presentation of the gospel, then all the Gen Z folks who are out marching right now are going to see the institutional church as a worthless relic of history. And some of them will keep faith in Jesus, but just not be part of a church. And others will walk away from faith because they see it as something that is pushing individual morality, but has no useful good to all of society. And so this is really a wake-up call for the church, that if it doesn't begin to go ahead and integrate justice into how it presents the gospel and why Jesus came, then we're 100 years from now, churches are going to be dead or empty.
I agree. You know, Jesus says that we are the salt of the earth. We are the light, and we should be salt and light in the earth. The church has been a sleeping giant. The church was asleep in 1962 when they took prayer out of school. The church was sleeping in 1980, I think, when they took the Ten Commandments off the walls. And dare I say, the church was sleeping in 2015 when we allowed gay marriage. So the church has been sleeping. There are some things that the church should be leading the charge on. Some issues are not church issues, but there are some things when it comes to atrocities toward the Bible, which is our standard of social justice. The church has just been a sleeping giant, and I thank God for the position I'm in, to where pastors have an opportunity, because we have a platform, and we can weekly speak out against atrocities or any issues that's hurting our people. And so we can lead the charge from the pulpit. But I think one of the problems is, in Milwaukee particularly, is that we really don't have any Black leadership. There's no person that we can point to that has a voice that say, that's our leader, and that's who we're going to rally around, and that's who we're going to support. We just don't have the Martin Luther Kings and those persons anymore that will be on the battlefield fighting this good fight for social justice. And I think that's a huge loss as far as the church is concerned.
I'm going to go off script just a minute, because you brought up something, Kurt, that was interesting. You said biblical justice. And I'm thinking about hate groups like the neo-Nazis, the KKK, all who have taken biblical justice and hijacked it for their own means. So how do you combat these bigotry, these groups of bigotry who use the same scriptures you're talking about to oppress?
That is a very good question. And it's one of the reasons why urban apologetics is it's so different than anything that you would learn in seminary, because it's a whole different dynamic that you have to fight with now, because the slave boats that would bring the slaves to United States, the name of the boat was Jesus. If you look at one of the Bibles, the old Bible, the imprint on the Bible is a picture of actually the slave boat with all the slaves lined up in so many different forms. And so when you begin to think about that, and how, evil groups have taken, what God meant for good and basically destroyed it. I mean, we have a huge challenge on our hands to present a gospel that's not the white man's gospel, because you get that a lot in the urban community, where you preaching the white man's religion, and that's not really what we had in Africa. They stole our religion in Africa, when in reality, we can trace Christianity back to Africa in the 3rd century, Carthage of Africa, North Africa. But again, it creates a huge challenge to sell Christianity to the urban community, because it's been used to propagate slavery. The Bible was used to preach to the slaves to be obedient to their masters, and all this different stuff. And so it creates some difficulty to sell our faith in our community, not to mention when you have churches who for years who have remained quiet up until this latest event. And I'm not talking using broad strokes. I'm just talking on the huge dynamic. You have many churches that never said anything. And I'm talking about, you even had some multi-ethnic churches who were led by white pastors who have never said anything in regards to the injustice that was happening to the members, their Black members that's sitting right in their own pews. And again, I'm not using broad strokes, but it existed and it happened. And so people that's outside of the church, they look at that and they say, well, you're stupid for preaching the white man's religion. And so we're constantly battling that and trying to sell our faith that the Bible is essentially for all people, that Christianity is for all people.
I think one of the misgivings here is the idea that the church is selling the faith. I don't think we should be trying to sell it to anyone. It's about how do we live it? How do we walk it out? Back to what Pastor Boyd said around be a good neighbor to your neighbor, right? So if we love our neighbor as ourselves, that is where we live out, we walk out our faith. And if we don't want to be slaughtered in the street, if we, whoever you are, and if white folk, if you don't want to be disproportionately incarcerated, if you don't want to be redlined and have to live in certain areas of the city or in certain counties or whatever the case may be, if you don't want any of those things, then do that for your neighbor, right? So if we walk that out with each other, then that'll look different. And I don't think it's about selling anything to anyone. And we have to get past these traditional ways of seeing the church and the faith, that if you talk to most people, they do believe. It's just that their belief doesn't look the ways that maybe yours does or ours or anybody's does. And then it's having those conversations and getting to know each other, breaking bread with each other and finding out what is it that you believe. This is what I believe, sharing your faith, and they can share theirs. Sometimes the problem is that the church is coming at people, the community, groups of people in a very hierarchical, very demeaning or condescending way. And that has to change. And so I think that is one of the ways in which the church perpetuates systems of oppression. And so then people are naturally going to reject that.
But there's also an issue of people who believe the same gospel that you believe, and they're bigots. Mm-hmm. And they're using that gospel to perpetuate their hate for another group. So I understand what you're saying. I just want to know, how do you combat that? Because they're using the same book, the same scriptures that you believe and that you are teaching to your congregations, but they're flipping it around. And yes, definitely from the beginning of slavery, but I'm saying present day, neo-Nazis, KKK, who will say they love God and Christ, but at the same time will torch and lynch someone. How do you reconcile that with your congregation?
Shannon, that's where true Christian apologetics comes into play. Pastors have to go to school. You got to study. You got to learn so you can rightly defend the gospel. If you can't do this, then perhaps you need to step off the pulpit. But when you look at slavery, for example, the bigots could say, well, God condones slavery. He invented slavery. That's all through the Old Testament. But you have to understand that was an indentured servitude. It wasn't like you just go steal somebody out of their country and bring them to your country and make them work for you for life and treat them like or less than a mule. That was indentured servitude. Those persons were hiring themselves out perhaps to pay off a debt or whatever it was. But then the person who owned them, quote unquote, had to release them after 7 years. And so there was a policy in that kind of slavery. It wasn't the kind of slavery that the Americans did to Black folks in this country. And so if you can't defend the faith properly, then I would suggest that any pastor, you need to go to school and get some kind of teachings and learnings on apologetics, because it's so important. And you're right, a bigot or anyone else can take the Bible and you can make the Bible say whatever you want it to say. But it's all about content. And if you don't understand the content of the scriptures, then the Holy Writ is severely damaged.
Shannon, I would point out that in the book of Acts, we see Paul calling out Peter on his racism against the Gentiles. In John 17, 20 through 23, Jesus prays prays for himself and then for the disciples and then for those who will believe the disciples' words, which is all of us. And he prays for unity. And you can exposit from Genesis to Revelation that God's plan was not simply to bless the Israelites, but it was to bless all of humanity through Abram and his descendants. And so Kurt is right. We just need to know what the story of Scripture is, and then when someone cherry picks out particular verses to try to support their point of view, I think the curse of Ham being one that is a typical trope that people use. Scripture can go ahead and counteract those if we know it well enough. The question is, are people willing to listen to it when you present it?
Mm-hmm. And I come from a denomination that struggles with being statistically the most white denomination in America, and the racist murderer of the Emanuel 9 in South Carolina grew up in my denomination. So how did a child, a youth, grow up in one of our churches, hear the sermons being preached, receive the catechesis and faith lessons that we offer, and still end up the way that he ended up? There's a double standard that we have. If you think back to the terrorist attacks our country had, and at that time, and even still today, there's this expectation by white Americans, by Christian Americans, that Muslims need to speak out when there's terrorists involved, and decry, denounce those actions. But then we don't have that expectation for Christian Americans when our own do actions that are terroristic in the same way. And so we need to have that expectation of ourselves, as Kurt was saying, from the pulpit, as the other Kurt was saying, that the gospel itself is a witness of biblical justice, to incorporate that gospel message from the pulpit in our sermons, in our youth groups, in our catechesis, in our lessons, in our adult forums. We need to be intentional about that message with our people.
Hey, Shannon, I want to add something really quickly I think there's another aspect of this that's really important, and that's the education system. If I'm looking at, the young people that I work with from a church perspective, and even adults, maybe we have them for 2 hours a week. Maybe we have them for 4 hours out of an entire week. But every day in the education system, from children on up, we're taught all of our history through an educational lens that's very much dominant culture driven. So for me, it's very easy to understand how people can look at the Bible and still see someone else as less than, when all of your life you've been taught history from a very whitewashed perspective. You've been taught that Black people basically came onto the scene as slaves. We're not taught of the many inventions, the many things that we've done, the empires, the nations, all of the fantastic creations that have come from our culture. We're not exposed to that. So our African-American youth grow up not seeing themselves as being successful in the history of the world. What does that do to their minds? What does that do to their development? If the only visible role models they see that look like them in success is a sports player, an athlete, or some type of entertainer, that's what they go off to be. When on the flip side, my young white and Caucasian brothers and sisters, they grow up and they're seeing all of these images, all of these things that showing the greatness and what they've accomplished and what they're able to do. And they want to be, I want to be an astronaut. I want to be this. I want to be that. And if I'm looking for someone that looks like me, who's been successful, I'm not seeing that. I'm not being taught about that, even though there are millions of examples. But those examples have been wiped from the history books. Those examples are not being on television. We were laughing at one of our last meetings, and we're talking about even the movie, The 10 Commandments. Now, y'all know good and well, all of the Hebrews was Black back then. Everybody, all of the pharaohs, the Egyptians who built those wonderful pyramids that we still talk about, they wasn't white folks. But our visuals, our TV shows, everything is showing a very different perspective. So someone who grows up in a predominantly white environment has no relationship with African Americans or minorities in general. They're taught this type of history and this type of realization. All of the media, and I blame media a lot, because the images that are portrayed of us don't really reflect us. They reflect a narrative that shows us in a specific light. So then they grow up and we're wondering why the KKK still exists, because we're still being shown, taught, educated that Black people are less than. We're still seeing us as different. We're still seeing us on the 9 o'clock news. Most of my friends are not arrested. Most of them are not shooting guns. They are not running drugs. But if you look at the news, that's all you see. Oh, look at them Black people. So when I run into people that do not have relationship with us or didn't grow up in areas where they are around us, their perception of who we are does not match up with the reality. And I completely understand how they can look at the scripture from their point of view and from their level of education and make the decisions that they're making. So I feel like there's even an aspect of the education system that we as pastors, we have to go at. We have to teach that within our spheres of influence. We have to try to influence the public school systems and the private school systems. We've got to teach an equitable history as well if we want to see this future change.
Representation is so key, Jay, and that is just a great segue into my final question. And what you reminded me of is something that TD Jakes said the other day that I was listening to. And he says, when you write the books you read, you always win. So if that is all you see, that is all you know. But my last question for all of you to ponder is, if there's one thing America could do to mitigate the wrongs against Blacks in this country, what would it be? And I'm going to start with Kurt to give some of the others a few minutes to kind of think about that. But what would that tangible thing be as we're talking about moving forward and righting wrongs and biblical justice?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, when I take a peek at it, and we're talking about over 400 years of free land, over 400 years of free labor, and I still live in the central city. I could live anywhere I want to, but I made the decision to still live in the central city, so I see what my people look like, and I see what my community looks like, and some of the things that we could address. And so for me, I think that probably the only thing that could mitigate some of the damage that has been done from the free labor for over 400 years, the Jim Crow era, is I'm a proponent of reparations. I think reparations should happen for the Black community. It's the only community that again, America has just said, just forgive us. We're not responsible for it. And if we really want to get serious about changing the Black community, and you know, I know there's a lot of people who feel very, very harsh about reparations for the Black community, but if you're asking what can we do to then support reparations for the Black community, I think that's going to be one step in the right direction of helping the Black community to overcome the years and years and years of being behind the 8 ball. So I guess that's where I would start.
I'll jump in on that one too, because I agree with Kurt. I think that's a discussion that has to be had, not just in amazing articles that have come out in recent years and other things about it, but getting really down into what would that look like? Because there has been such a usage of people for so long with little to come back in that direction. So I do think that a massive attention to what would reparations look like that really gets at some of the real legislative aspects of that. What would a program like that involve in terms of economic development? What does that mean in terms of where people are at now? How does that get administered? And so taking it a level deeper around, I think reparations is a very, very important discussion.
Everyone has ideas and then challenges to ideas on how to make it work. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, which is the first suburb north of Chicago. It's about 80,000 people. It's a very racially diverse community. And they recently, the state of Illinois now allows for sales of cannabis. And so the city of Evanston decided to take all the revenue from sales of cannabis in the city to improve Black home ownership opportunities in the city. And so that is just one practical, small way, one community of how to to do something that truly builds wealth. And home ownership, more than anything else in American history, has built wealth for people.
I think you have to fight it in your own spheres of influence as well, which plays a role. You know, from a reparations standpoint, if you own a business and you know you have the ability to hire, you know, are you looking to make diverse hires? Are you looking for people that maybe don't fit the mold of where you've grown up or what you might be used to? Are you willing to step outside of those comfort zones? Are you willing to continue being uncomfortable? Because maybe this is, you know, these conversations aren't easy for everyone. For me, I look at that. That's all part of reparations as well. Are you willing? We've been uncomfortable for so long. Are you willing to be uncomfortable in the conversations? The areas where you can make a difference. When someone makes that off-color joke or that off-color comment, will you stand up and say, hey, you can't do that, or that's not welcome here? Will you voice the right thing, even when maybe it's your mother, it's your father, whoever that might be? I think there's opportunities for people to stand up and to be heard and to speak out for people of color who have been yelling this for so long. But I think that if the dominant culture can begin saying the same things and sharing that in their areas as they learn, to me, that'll go a long way as well.
I think part of the discussion of reparations has to be education and how we finance our education in this country. The trajectory set in criminal justice and home ownership and education, in policing, all these have come from our history and they affect our present. And we won't provide opportunities for advancement if we continue to finance education locally, and those local disparities continue to play out in opportunities that our students have. And so if we could provide the same educational opportunities to every child in this country, we would see people being able to advance better than they are right now.
The question was, is there one thing, and Arnita, I'll let you go last because I know you probably have the most profound thing to say, but the question was, is there one thing? And I don't know one thing. Racism now, today in 2020 is systemic. And that means it's a bunch of stuff. There's a lot of atrocities that's being committed toward Black people. And some stuff is very visible and some things are not so visible. But when it comes to housing and school and education and healthcare, everything, basically America needs to start over. The Constitution needs to be rewritten. I was reading, you know, it's funny, just yesterday, I was reading the Declaration of Independence because 4th of July is coming up. And as I was reading the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson penned, he was arguing the fact that he wanted to be separate now from Britain. King, I believe it was King George, did all of these atrocities, and Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence began to list all of the stuff that the King of Britain did to these 13 states, these 13 colonies. And so he was arguing for all of these atrocities committed against these 13 colonies. This is why we want to be our own independent state. Now, I believe Malcolm X was kind of constituting that thing too back in the 60s. Suppose Black people said, okay, well, since America have so much problems with Black folks, how about you just give us the southern half of the country and we'll create our own country and we can be called the Southern United States, and we have to have our own president and we have our own constitution. I mean, can you imagine that? And so, in my opinion, everything has to be rewritten. I mean, because it's systemic, and because it's in the system, then the code, the language, the hidden text is all is written in code in the system, and all of that has to be changed for us to start over and get this thing right.
So he took my answer, and that's why he wanted to go before me. But I would say dismantle systems and institutions of oppression. Every institution in this country has been built on white supremacy and racism, and so power and privilege. And so The one thing America could do is dismantle systems and institutions of oppression, change laws and policies that disproportionately impact and disenfranchise Black folks and anyone that it disenfranchises. And so a lot would have to start over. And it's not like it's impossible. It's not working well anyway. It's working for those who choose to oppress and to benefit from that. However, it's not working for the rest of us. So dismantling those systems and rebuilding them.
I think we could go on
with the police department,
past our hour mark, but we just touched the tip of the iceberg. But nonetheless, this conversation was a starter, and I hope that everyone felt safe and comfortable enough to have their voices heard. But most importantly, I'm hoping that our viewers on our Facebook page got a chance to get inside of the minds of some of those faith leaders who are working to bring change, who are dealing with the realities of what is happening in the world and how to bring their congregations to a space and place where they can reflect what God has created. I appreciate all of you guys for taking the time to talk with me today. Until the next time we meet.